Okay, now we would like to discuss another method for solving quadratic equations specifically, and it is called the square root method, and it is based on the square root property. And the square root property says the following. Suppose that d is a real number. If you have that p squared equals d, so p is something, it could be any algebraic expression here. If p squared equals d, then p equals plus or minus the square root of d. One way to remember this property is basically saying that if you start with an equation like this, you basically can take square root on both sides, provided that you put a plus or minus on one side. You see, if you put square root on the left-hand side, the square root of p squared is going to be p, and then on the right-hand side, you're going to have the square root of d. And that's valid as long as you put plus or minus d on one side. I mean, plus or minus the square root of d on one side. So you have to tag on that plus or minus. And this method is actually a special case of the zero product property and the difference of squares formula. How, you might ask? Well, here's why that's true. If, suppose for a second that p squared equals d, then you can move the d to the left-hand side, and you're going to get p squared minus d equals 0. Okay, but d is actually the same thing as the square root of d squared, because the square root and a square cancel each other off. So actually, square root and square cancel each other off to give you back d. So these two things are actually the same. Okay, and now you see that, and that is the difference of squares, so you can factor this. Remember, the first factor in the difference of squares formula is the same thing you will get when you drop the 2's. So the first factor will be p minus square root of d, and then the second one is the same but with a plus in the middle. And then, according to the zero product property, I have these two things that when multiplied together give you 0. That means that either the first one is 0, so you set each of the factors equal to 0, or the second one equals 0. And then when you solve this, you move that to the other side, you're going to get that p equals square root of d, or p equals minus square root of d. So you see that what you get is that p could be the square root of d, or p could be negative the square root of d. So we usually summarize that as writing p equals plus or minus the square root of d. That's how we typically summarize that, and that's exactly what the square root property says. If you start out with p squared equals d and you do some algebra, you end up with p equals plus or minus the square root of d. Okay? And the easy way to remember this is what I told you. If you start with any equation like that, you are allowed to take square root on both sides, provided that on one side you put plus or minus. So basically, that's the only condition, the only rule that you have to follow when taking square root on both sides of an equation. All right, so because this is a special case of the zero product property, technically is not really necessary that you know this method. If you know the zero product property, that's enough. However, when this method applies, it simplifies things substantially. So it's good to know, because when you're able to deploy it, it really makes life a lot easier. Make things so much quicker. So how you know you can use this method or not? Well, you know you can use this method if in the equation you only have two terms. See, there's only two things, and one of the things is squared. Okay, so you have the square of something, and then that equals something else. And maybe this is 0 and this d is on the other side. You can always push it to the other side. But the idea is that you have only two things. On one side you have the square of something, and you have something else on the other side. So you only have two terms, one of which is squared. If you have that, then this is using the square root property is the quickest way of solving the equation. So for example, this one right here says solve for x squared equals 25. Okay, you see I have two terms and one side is squared. So this is ripe for the square root property. The square root property tells me that I'm just gonna get p, so you see the variable that is the thing that is squared but without the square. So if I take square root on both sides, I'm gonna get x. And on the right hand side, you take the square root of 25, but you have to remember that you have to put plus or minus. So take square root on both sides, and on one side put plus or minus. On this side where not the x, where the x opposite, the side opposite of the x. So in this case, this side. And then of course you simplify and you get your answer. So square root of 25 is 5. So x equals plus or minus 5. So that is the answer. That's it. The answer is x equals plus or minus 5. Sometimes in some online homework systems, they ask you to enter the answer separately. So you might have to enter this separately. So you may have to enter x equals 5 or x equals negative 5. And some other online systems wants you to write them like at once separated by a comma. So it could be like 5 comma negative 5. So it depends on how it asks you to enter your answer. But there's two solutions either way, 5 and negative 5. Okay, and that's it. Just take square root on both sides and put plus or minus on one side and then simplify. So let's do another one. Let's do this one right here. So that one says 2y plus 1 squared equals negative 4. So you see there's, in this one also there's two terms. There's one term on the left, one term on the right, and one of them is squared. So this is good for applying the square root property. So all we have to do is we're going to take square root on both sides. On the left hand side, what that does is just gets rid of the square. And then on the right hand side, you take the square root as well, but you have to put plus or minus. You cannot forget that. That's the rule. You have to put plus or minus. Okay. And then you simplify and you find y. So this is what? 2y plus 1. Let's simplify this. The square root of negative 4. What is that? Remember how you do this. This means the square root of 4i. The square root of a negative number, negative 4 means the square root of 4i. Which simplifying further, that means plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2, so 2i. Okay, and then you get that you want to solve for y, so you can move the 1 to the left, to the right, so you're going to get 2y. When you move it to the right, it becomes negative, so negative 1 plus or minus 2i, and then you divide by 2 to get y. So y equals negative 1 plus or minus 2i, all that over 2. And then remember that complex numbers are not reported like that. You cannot report this number like that. This is not a standard form. You have to split this. So this is going to be negative 1 over 2, so negative 1 over 2 plus or minus 2 over 2 I. But again, 2 over 2 can be simplified, so you should. This simplifies to y equals negative a half, and then plus or minus 2 over 2 is 1, so 1i, but we never write 1i, we just write I, and that is it. That would be the solution. Y equals negative a half plus or minus I. And of course, this is an equation in y, so the instructions really should be solve the equation, not solve for x, because I'm using all sorts of variables. Okay, so that's it. Okay, let's do this other one. That one. Maybe you should stop the video right here and attempt it on your own. Okay, first thing is, I don't know if you caught this, but first thing is you really need to have the square all by itself on one side. Right now, well, in the first two examples, the things squared were all by themselves, but this one is not quite ready yet because I have these two here that shouldn't be there because I need something squared all by itself, and that two there is intruding. We need to get rid of it. So first step would be to divide by 2 on both sides. So if you divide by 2 both sides, you're going to get x plus 3 squared equals 2. So divide by 2 both sides. All right? Now it's good to go because now I have something squared equals a number. So now you take square root on both sides, and the square root property says you can take square root on both sides provided that you put plus or minus on, on one side. So then we get x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. Okay, and then you move the 3, the positive 3, to the other side. And of course, when you move it, it becomes negative. So you get negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 2. Again, remember that you can report it like this. So sometimes they might ask you to enter them separately. So that really means that one solution is negative 3 plus square root of 2. The other solution is negative 3 minus square root of 2. So those are the two possibilities, okay? The two solutions. Okay, and let's do one last example of the square root property or the square root method. So I want something squared all by itself equals a number. So this thing needs to move. You need to move this to the other side because I need the thing that is squared all by itself. So moving that to the right becomes positive 5 halves. And this is still not good because the thing squared is still not all by itself. So you need to divide by 2. So this is going to be 2 plus 1 squared equals, and then what do you get when you divide 5 halves by 2? 5 halves divided by 2, what is that? Well, this is the same as 5 halves. Dividing by a number is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by half, and then multiplying across, that's 5/4. Okay, so dividing both sides by 2 here, 5 halves divided by 2 gives me 5/4. So this is 5/4. Okay, after that, what do we get? Now it is good to go. Now I have something squared equals a number, and I can take square root on both sides. If I take square root on the left, I get z plus 1. When I take the square root on the right, I have to make sure I don't forget to put plus or minus. Okay? And now we're going to simplify this. So you get z plus 1 equals, let's simplify this. This is plus or minus. You can distribute the radical. So this is square root of 5 over square root of 4. Square root of 5, well, that's not a whole number, but the square root of 4 is 2. So actually then this simplifies as plus or minus square root of 5 over 2. And then lastly, you can move the 1 to the left, to the right hand side, and you're going to get z equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 5 over 2. And that is the final answer. Those are the two solutions of that equation.